Stop! The shout sliced through the noisy terminal like a knife. People stopped mid-conversation, kids stopped laughing, and even the announcements seemed to fade. Captain Daniel Hayes froze where he stood. His arms tightened around the small wooden casket draped with the American flag. The weight wasn't just physical. It was emotional, heavier than anything he had ever carried. Inside that casket was Private First Class Ryan Mitchell, 19 years old, barely out of high school, a young soldier who had given everything for his country, and now he was on his final journey home. Passengers glanced over, some whispering, others craning their necks to see. Phones were already being pulled out to record what was happening. The airline agent walked briskly toward Daniel, her face tense, her tone cold. "Sir, you cannot board with that," she said, pointing to the casket. "Oversized items must go through cargo." Daniel's jaw clenched so tight it hurt. He wasn't just any passenger today. He was on official duty. He was an escort, a soldier chosen to bring a fallen brother home to his family. This wasn't just protocol. This was a sacred mission. He straightened his back, his voice steady yet filled with restrained anger. "This isn't cargo," he said, locking eyes with the agent. "This is a fallen hero. He stays with me." The agent sighed, clearly irritated. "Sir, I understand, but policy is policy. We cannot make exceptions." Daniel's blood boiled. He had faced hostile enemies overseas, but this was different. This was disrespect in its purest form, hiding behind rules. He took a step closer, his voice lowering but filled with steel. "You have no idea what this means. You have no idea what it took to bring him back here. I will not let him travel like luggage." By now, the crowd was growing. Travelers stopped what they were doing. Some whispered, "What's going on? He's carrying a soldier's casket. Why aren't they letting him through?" A little boy holding his father's hand asked softly, "Daddy, why are they stopping him?" The father knelt and whispered, "Because some people forget what respect means." The airline agent folded her arms, trying to stand her ground. "Sir, I'm not trying to be disrespectful, but if I let you through, I break company policy." Daniel's eyes burned, not with tears, but with a soldier's resolve. "You want to talk about policies? Our policy, the military's policy, is to never leave a fallen soldier behind. And I promised his mother he wouldn't be left alone. So go ahead, call security. Call whoever you need. But this soldier is not going into cargo." The agent hesitated, her confidence cracking under the weight of his words and the eyes of dozens of passengers watching. People began to murmur louder, frustration building among them. "This is ridiculous," one man said. "He's carrying a hero," a woman added, shaking her head. "Let him through," someone shouted. The tension in the air was thick, almost suffocating. The agent reached for her radio with trembling hands. "Security, we have a situation here," she said. Daniel stood his ground, chest out, eyes fierce. He wasn't moving. Not now. Not ever. As the seconds ticked by, more passengers started to film. Others moved closer, ready to speak up. It wasn't just Daniel against the airline anymore. The entire terminal was beginning to take sides. Somewhere in the distance, a child's voice broke the silence, soft but clear. "Mommy, he's protecting the soldier, right?" "Yes, sweetheart," the mother replied, tears in her eyes. "He is." And with that, Daniel knew he was not alone in this fight. Hours earlier, before the chaos of the terminal, the world had been silent. The only sound inside the dimly lit military hangar was the soft echo of footsteps and the faint rustle of a flag moving in the breeze. Daniel Hayes stood tall, his uniform crisp, but inside, his heart was heavy. Before him, a small wooden casket rested on a platform. It was draped with the American flag, its colors vibrant against the somber setting. Ryan Mitchell's mother, a fragile woman with eyes swollen from endless tears, walked toward Daniel. Her hands trembled as she reached for his. She clung to him as if holding on to the last piece of her son. "Please," she whispered, her voice cracking under the weight of grief. "Don't let my boy be alone on the way home." Daniel swallowed hard. As a soldier, he had faced dangerous missions, but nothing had ever felt this heavy. He looked her in the eyes and gave the only answer a man like him could give. "I promise you, ma'am, he won't be alone. Not for a single second." She nodded weakly, clutching his hand tighter. "Thank you. Thank you for bringing my baby back." In that moment, Daniel made a vow, not just as part of his duty, but as a man, as a brother in arms. Soldiers never leave a fallen brother behind. Not in the battlefield, not in life, not even in death. Hours later, standing in the middle of the airport terminal, that promise echoed in his mind like a drumbeat. This wasn't just a coffin. This wasn't just a job. This was Ryan's final march home, and Daniel was his escort. But now, the sacred mission was being challenged by an airline agent with a rulebook. The agent's voice was firm, almost cold. "Sir, this casket must go through cargo. I can't allow you to board with it." Passengers began to murmur, whispering to one another. Some stood up from their seats, craning their necks to see what was happening. The tension spread like wildfire. "Just let the man through," a traveler muttered from the back of the line. "He's carrying a soldier," another said louder, anger creeping into his tone. "This isn't right," someone else added. The agent, however, remained stubborn. She pulled out her radio, her hand shaking slightly as the situation grew more intense. "Security, we have a problem here," she said into the device. Daniel stared at her, his eyes like steel. Inside, he felt the weight of Ryan's mother's words pressing against his heart. He remembered her tears, her voice, her plea. There was no way, no way, he was letting this boy be treated like baggage. He took a deep breath. His voice came out calm, but each word burned with the fire of conviction. "Go ahead. Call whoever you need to call. Bring your security, bring your manager, bring the entire airport if you have to. But hear me clearly. This soldier is not going in cargo." The surrounding passengers were no longer just bystanders. They were witnesses to something bigger than themselves. Some nodded in agreement. Others raised their phones to record, capturing every moment. "Unbelievable," one woman said under her breath. "How can they even argue about this?" The crowd grew restless. It was no longer just Daniel standing against the airline's rules. People were starting to take sides, and most were on his. Daniel didn't move. His boots were planted like roots in the ground. His arms held the casket close, as if shielding it from the world. Every second felt like an eternity, but he was ready to fight, because a promise to a mother isn't something you break. And in that moment, Daniel Hayes was no longer just a soldier on escort duty. He was a wall of honor, unshakable, protecting the dignity of the young hero who couldn't speak for himself. The agent's voice cracked as she repeated into the radio, "Security, please respond." Passengers exchanged glances. Some whispered prayers. Others simply waited, their faces filled with anticipation. Whatever was about to happen next, one thing was certain: Daniel wasn't backing down. Not today. Not ever. Within minutes, 2 airport security guards rushed into the terminal. Their eyes scanned the growing crowd, the phones pointed at them, and finally landed on Daniel standing rigidly with the flag-draped casket in his arms. One guard stepped forward cautiously. "What's going on here?" he asked, his tone calm but firm. The airline agent wasted no time. "This man is refusing to follow airline policy," she explained, pointing at Daniel as if he were a criminal. "He's trying to carry an oversized item onto the plane. It must go through cargo." The guards exchanged a glance, their brows furrowed. They looked at Daniel, who stood tall, his eyes unyielding. Daniel took a single step forward, his voice steady yet commanding. "I am Captain Daniel Hayes of the United States Army," he said, each word cutting through the tension. "The young man in this casket gave his life for this country. He is a fallen soldier, and I swore to his mother that he would not travel alone. You will not treat him like a suitcase." The guards hesitated, their expressions shifting from confusion to something closer to respect. They were caught between enforcing rules and recognizing the gravity of the situation. But while they hesitated, the crowd did not. "This is wrong," a man shouted from the back, his voice echoing through the terminal. "You don't treat a soldier like that," a woman cried out, stepping forward. And then, from the crowd, a figure emerged, an older man wearing a faded Marine Corps cap. His posture was stiff, his face weathered by years of service. Without a word, he walked up to Daniel and stood shoulder to shoulder with him. "If he's not boarding with that casket," the veteran growled, his voice filled with grit, "then neither am I." The terminal fell silent for a moment, the weight of his words sinking in. Then, like a spark igniting a flame, others followed. "I'm with him," another man said, stepping out of line. "Me too," added a woman holding her child's hand. "Count me in," shouted someone from across the hall. One by one, passengers began to stand up, voices rising. 10, 20, 50 people, they formed an unspoken alliance, a wall of support behind Daniel. The chants started softly at first, but quickly grew louder, echoing through the entire terminal. Let him through. Let him through. The energy was electric. Travelers who had been strangers minutes ago were now united, their voices merging into a roar. Phones recorded every angle, capturing not just an argument, but a moment of solidarity and honor. The airline agent's confidence wavered. Her once firm posture began to crumble under the weight of the crowd's outrage. She glanced nervously at the guards, but they, too, looked uncertain. Even they seemed to understand that this was no ordinary policy violation. Passengers were now filming live, streaming the confrontation online. Comments poured in, viewers enraged that anyone would try to force a fallen soldier into cargo. The veteran beside Daniel leaned slightly toward him and said in a low voice, "You're not alone, son. We've got your back." Daniel nodded, his grip on the casket firm. He didn't smile. This wasn't a moment for celebration. It was a moment for standing his ground, for keeping a promise. The crowd grew louder. Let him through. Show some respect. Honor the soldier. The chanting shook the walls. The airline agent, pale and flustered, stepped back slightly. She looked to the guards for help, but they remained silent, as if silently agreeing with the crowd. This was no longer a simple disagreement over airline rules. This was a stand for respect, for dignity, for something far greater than policies and procedures. Every second felt like history being written in that terminal. Every voice that rose up carried the same message. Honor him. Honor the fallen. Honor the promise. ***. The airline agent's hand trembled as she gripped her radio, unsure of what to say next. The crowd was watching. The cameras were rolling. The world was about to see what decision she would make. And at the center of it all stood Daniel Hayes, unshaken, a soldier surrounded by strangers who refused to let him stand alone. Just as the chanting of "Let him through" reached its peak, a woman in a sharp navy suit rushed into the terminal. Her badge read Operations Manager. Her face was flushed, her steps quick. The entire terminal went quiet, waiting to see what would happen. "What's the issue here?" she demanded, scanning the crowd, the security guards, and finally the airline agent. The agent, clearly rattled, began explaining nervously, "Ma'am, this passenger is refusing to follow airline policy. He's attempting to bring an oversized." But before she could finish, the manager raised her hand to silence her. Her gaze turned to Daniel, who stood with the casket in his arms, the flag draped across it catching the light of the terminal. There was no anger in his face, only unbreakable resolve. The manager stepped closer, her voice softer now. "Sir," she said, "I apologize for this misunderstanding. Of course, you and the soldier will board together." For a brief second, the terminal remained still. Then the silence broke, not with arguments, but with a wave of applause. The crowd erupted, cheering and clapping. Some passengers wiped their eyes. Others hugged the people next to them. Even a few airline employees, usually trained to remain neutral, clapped quietly, their eyes glistening with emotion. Daniel nodded at the manager. "Thank you," he said simply. There was no smile on his face, no triumph in his voice. This wasn't about winning an argument. This was about something far greater, the honor and dignity of a young man who had given his all. The boarding process began, but it wasn't like any other flight. There were no impatient sighs, no complaints about delays. Passengers stepped aside respectfully, allowing Daniel to walk down the jet bridge first, carrying the flag-draped casket. Every single person stood still, watching as he passed. When Daniel entered the plane, the atmosphere shifted. The chatter stopped. The usual hum of boarding was replaced by silence, so deep you could hear the faint sound of the engines outside. Passengers on both sides of the aisle placed their hands over their hearts as Daniel walked slowly down toward the front of the plane. Some bowed their heads. Others wiped away tears they didn't try to hide. A few whispered, "Thank you," as he passed. The airline crew, often trained to stay professional, stood at attention. One flight attendant's lips trembled as she whispered, "God bless him." Daniel secured the casket in a specially prepared area near the front. He placed his hand on it gently, as if to reassure the young soldier that he wasn't alone. The aircraft captain's voice came over the speaker, steady yet filled with emotion. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "today, We have the honor of transporting a fallen soldier home to his family. We ask that you join us in a moment of silence to pay your respects." Instantly, the cabin went still. No one moved. No one spoke. The silence was powerful, almost sacred. Some passengers closed their eyes. Others stared at the flag, reflecting on the price of freedom. The little boy from the terminal clutched his father's hand and whispered, "Daddy, he's a hero, isn't he?" "Yes, son," the father replied softly. "He is." The silence lasted for what felt like forever, but no one dared to break it. In that stillness, strangers became united, not by rules or policies, but by respect. When the moment ended, the pilot's voice returned. "Thank you," he said simply. And with that, the engines roared to life, carrying not just passengers but the weight of honor across the sky. For the rest of the flight, the mood was different. People spoke in hushed tones. There were no complaints about snacks or seating. Everyone understood they were part of something bigger than themselves. Daniel sat near the casket, his eyes fixed forward. He wasn't resting, he was keeping watch. Because his promise wasn't fulfilled yet, the young soldier still had to make it home. Above the clouds, the plane flew on, carrying not just a fallen hero, but also the collective respect of every soul on board. The engines roared steadily as the plane sliced through the clouds, but inside the cabin, there was an unusual peace. No one complained about legroom, no one demanded extra snacks, and no one fidgeted impatiently waiting to land. Instead, the passengers sat quietly, many staring out the windows, lost in thought. Daniel sat close to the flag-draped casket, never once letting it out of his sight. His posture was rigid, his eyes sharp, as though he were still on duty. In a way, he was. Escorting a fallen soldier was more than a responsibility, it was a sacred watch. The young man inside that wooden box had once stood guard for the country. Now it was Daniel's turn to stand guard for him. A few passengers occasionally glanced at Daniel, their eyes filled with admiration and sorrow. One woman, unable to hold back her tears, quietly passed him a handwritten note that said simply, "Thank you for what you're doing." Daniel gave her a small nod, but he said nothing. His focus remained on Ryan Mitchell's final journey. The hours passed quietly. The hum of the engines mixed with the heavy stillness that filled the air. It was as if the entire plane knew this wasn't just a regular flight. This was a flight of honor. When the aircraft began its descent, the captain's voice came over the speaker once again, softer this time. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are honored to be bringing home a fallen soldier today. Upon landing, we ask that you remain seated as we conduct a special ceremony on the tarmac. Thank you for your respect. Thank you for your respect." As the wheels touched down, the passengers felt a weight in the moment, an unspoken reverence. The plane taxied slowly, not to the usual gate, but to a special, isolated section of the runway. Waiting there were military personnel in dress uniforms, standing at attention. 2 fire trucks were parked nearby, their nozzles ready. When the aircraft came to a complete stop, the fire trucks sprayed twin arcs of water over the plane, a powerful and symbolic salute. The mist sparkled in the sunlight, creating a rainbow above the aircraft, as if nature itself was paying tribute. The cabin was silent. Some passengers reached for tissues. Others simply bowed their heads. The door opened, and Daniel stood, lifting the casket with the help of the honor guard waiting outside. As he stepped onto the tarmac, the passengers inside pressed their hands to the windows, watching as the soldier was carried off the plane. Outside, the honor guard lined the path, saluting as Daniel walked beside the casket. Each step he took was deliberate, steady, filled with pride and sorrow. The flag on the casket fluttered slightly in the breeze, but it never faltered, just like the men who carried it. At the end of the runway stood a woman clutching a small folded flag to her chest, Ryan Mitchell's mother. Her face was pale, streaked with tears, but her eyes burned with love and gratitude. When Daniel approached, she placed her hand gently on the casket before turning to him. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Thank you for keeping your promise." Daniel's throat tightened. He stood tall, saluted her with absolute respect, and said, his voice breaking, "Ma'am, we never leave our own behind." Her tears flowed freely as she nodded, clutching the flag tighter. The honor guard loaded the casket into the hearse, and with a final salute, Daniel watched as the vehicle drove slowly away, escorted by a line of police cars and motorcycles, sirens silent, but lights flashing in tribute. The passengers began to disembark, many of them crying, others walking silently, as if leaving a sacred place. Several stopped to shake Daniel's hand, to thank him, to tell him they would never forget what they had witnessed. And they wouldn't. None of them would. News of the incident spread quickly. Videos from passengers went viral, touching millions across the world. People saw how strangers had stood up together, how respect had triumphed over cold policy. The airline that had tried to stop Daniel issued a public apology. But they didn't stop there. They changed their policy, ensuring that no escort of a fallen soldier would ever face such an obstacle again. Because on that day, one young soldier's dignity was defended, not just by one man, but by an entire plane full of strangers who chose honor over convenience, respect over rules. And as the sun set behind the airport, painting the sky in gold and red, one thing was certain. That was a flight no one would ever forget.